She'd been killed in an absolutely brutal frenzy. He could fit his fist inside one of the wounds, on one of the knife wounds on her body, and other ones were so deep there were scratch marks on her bones. Her head was hanging from her body, and her throat had been slashed from ear to ear, and it was virtually hanging off.
When you think of Blackpool in years gone by, you may think of happy families piling on the beach with buckets and spades, children admiring the illuminations, or even watching a cabaret show on the pier. But some visit the seaside with deadly intentions. Over the last century, a number of women met gruesome deaths at the hands of their nefarious husbands, lovers, or even handsome but deadly strangers who preyed on their vulnerability. I met with Deborah Contessa, who knows all about the horrible historic murders of Blackpool. Today we've come to Leighton Cemetery, where Deborah is giving a tour of unmarked graves of the victims of some of the most notorious murders of the last century. One of these victims is Sarah Toomey, who was murdered at the hands of her husband in 1895. And to add further insult to her memory, she is now buried just a few feet away from her killer.
By the season of 1895, Sarah Toomey had been working at the Vauxhall pub for Richard Steed for many years. She worked there permanently. Her husband was sometimes in the employ of the Vauxhall, but he did work away as a labourer and only came back when he couldn't get work elsewhere. She was really well thought of and a lovely woman. Her husband, however, had had several affairs. It was thought they had a pretty solid marriage because she kept taking him back and she was happy working at the pub where she pretty much ran it. Why suddenly, this particular season, John decided he was going to end his relationship in the most horrible way, nobody knows. He came back to Blackpool in the end of the season, 1895, went to Bickerstaff's Butchers and purchased a hunting knife, but he had been known to go on hunting trips when he'd been in America. But as far as everybody else thought, he genuinely was buying a hunting knife to go away on a hunting trip with. It was the last day of the season. Sarah was hosting a party for the other staff at the Vauxhall. John, her husband, had turned up. There was much merriment, much drinking. But they kept it earlier in the afternoon because she had to sort the meals out for later in the day. They went up to bed, to Sarah's room, as did all the other staff, because Sarah knew she had to be back downstairs to make the tea for the paying guests. They went up to bed. Some of the other staff were a little bit later following up. They heard some banging coming from the room, but they were a married couple, so they minded their own business. It wasn't until it was nearly tea time and a couple of the waiters decided they'd better go and get John and Sarah up, simply because they were hungry and they needed feeding first. So they went up to the Toomey's bedroom door and they knocked quietly, not wanting to disturb them, but needing her to get up. The door wasn't quite shut properly, so they banged a little louder. When the door wasn't answered, they tentatively pushed it over, and on the floor, they saw Sarah, which was half on the floor, half on the bed. And one of them went to comment to the other how she must have been very drunk, much drunker than they thought that afternoon, because her head seemed to be hanging from her body. And then they realised that they'd actually seen the most grisly of sights. Her head was hanging from her body and her throat had been slashed from ear to ear, and it was virtually hanging off. No sign of her husband other than a bloodied shirt he'd left behind. He'd escaped, nobody knew where to. There were lots of rumours and tittle-tattle. There were rumours he might have committed suicide because the very last sighting of John was he'd gone to the Red Lion pub and he'd left a watch and a small parcel with the landlord, and he'd requested that in a few days' time it be given to his eldest daughter. Then on the 28th of October, an unidentifiable corpse was washed up on Rossall Beach, terribly bloated, in an awful state, but by counting the toes, because he had a couple of toes missing, they worked out that that would have been John Toomey. And yes, it's presumed he did throw himself in the sea and then washed up at Rossall. I think the worst atrocity is the fact that he is only buried a few yards from his wife. And people say to me, but murderers don't get buried in consecrated ground. But where do they bury them? Of course they do. It's just kept very quiet.
One of the most poignant things about particularly 3 of the women who are buried in this cemetery is how closely they are buried to their murderers. And in one case, buried in very close proximity to the doctor who signed the death certificate to say it was an accidental death when it clearly wasn't. And that really just feels, extremely horrible and disrespectful.
As we visit each unmarked grave, people lay handmade paper flower bouquets and light candles to remember those women who died in such horrific circumstances. The walk has been organised by Reclaim Blackpool, a campaign group who are working to make the resort safer for women. Nowhere is that more relevant than with the dreadful murder of Joan Long. During the Second World War, Joan was on a night out with her friends when she met a handsome American airman. But her night did not end well, as she was strangled in an air raid shelter.
I believe Joan Long was a very cheerful, salt of the earth Blackpool lass. She was a little bit naive. She'd gone out in Bispham with some girlfriends of hers, having a lovely time on one of her many nights out. They moved from Bispham into Blackpool. I'm not sure what pub they did end up in because they went round quite a few. And she got chatting to a very smart and very attractive aircraft mechanic. Basically, she went on a bit of a pub crawl with him. She really liked him. And she thought, she'd done quite well. She'd pulled. Where the Metropole Hotel is now, you've got the columns on the lower walk of the promenade. If you look very carefully around there, you can see an old doorway, because what they used to have under there in 1944, in the war years, there was an air raid shelter. And after she'd been spotted in this tram shelter with Thomas, we think he tempted her to go maybe a little bit further in the air raid shelter with him. And it was there the next morning, it was the early hours of Wednesday, that 2 civilians and 2 servicemen came upon the air raid shelter, and the civilians were actually looking for somewhere just to doss down for the night. The door wouldn't open, and they knew the door was never kept locked, so they pushed and pushed, and they realised that it was the partially clothed body of a young woman that was stopping them from opening the door. During a autopsy, Dr. Bruce, who was a police surgeon, concluded she had died of asphyxia due to manual strangulation. If that wasn't sad enough, I do know her brain was actually produced during the trial. They took her brain out and it was kept in a jar for a long time, and they produced it at the Thomas Montoya's court-martial, and that got more headlines. Girl's brain kept in jar than girl murdered did. Thomas Montoya was court-martialed and he was given 10 years hard labour, but he was sent back to his hometown in America to serve out his sentence. However, very recently, a historian that I'm in touch with quite a lot, he discovered Thomas Montoya's wedding certificate, and Thomas Montoya got married less than 2 years after he'd been sentenced to 10 years hard labour. He did not get married in prison, he got married in his hometown. And once he'd gone home, it does make you wonder if he just got to get on with his life.
I think that the story obviously was about a visiting airman, American airman, who came and took advantage of a Blackpool girl when he was visiting, and that absolutely does chime with the fact that we get so many visitors here who treat Blackpool as a good time and treat the women here like they are a good time. And part of what we've been doing is trying to say, women live here, we live here, this is where we're from, you know, respect our home, respect us, respect our bodies.
Join us after the break as we visit our final unmarked grave. Mary Starr was just getting used to life as a first-time mum when she was stabbed more than 20 times by her estranged husband. We also speak to a Safer Streets campaigner who reminds us why it's important to mourn these forgotten victims. See you after the break.
He could fit his fist inside one of the wounds, on one of the knife wounds on her body, and other ones were so deep there were scratch marks on her bones.
Welcome back. I'm here at Leighton Cemetery in Blackpool to pay respect to women who were brutally murdered and ultimately buried in unmarked graves. Our final tale is of Mary Starr, a young woman who had recently had her first baby, when she was stabbed more than 20 times in her own living room.
At the time of her death, Mary Starr was only 27. We're talking 1903, so she was quite old to be having her first baby. She was pregnant to this chap, and her parents would, well, her mother would rather that she was married to the baby's father. So she'd settled down with her new husband, Henry, who was a little bit older than her, 31, but unfortunately life, she didn't feel it was treating her too well, and she wanted out of the marriage. Absolutely dreadful arguments were overheard between the two of them. She wanted to seek a separation order, which was quite unheard of in those days. She'd had to get the police in, she'd been to the courts. He would go out and work, but he preferred to spend his money on going to the pub, gambling, things like that. Then he came home and still expected his baby to be clean and asleep, and his dinner to be on the table, and quite frankly she wasn't putting up with that, and I don't blame her. She went back to her mum's house, and she was staying there when he made his final visit to her. She was sat in the front room, they'd put the baby down to sleep. They were, I imagine, having a cup of tea, having a lovely time, when Henry snuck in through the back door. Now, he saw the bread knives on the side, so we don't know whether this was premeditated or not. He crept into the front room and he attacked both Mary and her mother with the bread knives he'd got from the kitchen. Mary, she had died from more than 20 stab wounds, and the doctor who came and examined her body said she'd been killed in an absolutely brutal frenzy. One of the wounds, the doctor said, he could fit his fist inside one of the wounds, on one of the knife wounds on her body, and other ones were so deep, when they did the post-mortem, that it had actually, there was scratch marks on her bones. That's how intent he had been in ending her life. Her mother was also attacked, but her mother did survive the attack. He had decided to do a runner, of course, at Henry, and he went to, I think it was the Duke of York. He went to the Duke of York Hotel, much like a lot of the chaps in these stories. He made his way to the pub, and he had a few shots in the Duke of York, a few shots of liquor, and then staggered towards the town centre. He was eventually found by the police, bloodied and drunk, in the underground toilets at Talbot Square. That's where they found him hiding. He did try and plead insanity, but nobody was having that. And the actual court case, I think it took 3 minutes for them to decide that his defence was paper thin, and he was sentenced to death by hanging.
As I walked around the cemetery, it occurred to me that if I wasn't here on this tour, I would never know these women were buried here. Deborah is a fountain of knowledge when it comes to people buried at Leighton. But she told me that it was only through painstaking research that she was able to locate the graves. Not only were these women buried unceremoniously, but in one instance the victim was actually buried within a few feet of her murderer. Didn't these women deserve better?
We just thought that Deborah's stories of the women that were buried in Leighton Cemetery in unmarked graves were really important to tell, because these are women whose stories have been missed from the history books and unceremoniously buried, so people can't even mourn them. So we wanted to bring those stories to light and really point out the parallels between the violence that led to their deaths and the violence that women experience today.